Well, good morning, everybody, and good morning in particular to Martyn Downer, friend of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, I think a great naval specialist and researcher, and somebody who specialises in finding new pieces of evidence, new pieces of material culture relating to Nelson. And Martyn, you've donated to us recently a very important letter from Admiral Nelson to Simon Taylor in Jamaica that is particularly pertinent to Nelson's views on slavery. Could you tell us really why this letter from Nelson to Taylor is so important?
So the letter was written in the last months of Nelson's life, after he had pursued the French fleet to the Caribbean. It was written on board Victory, and in the letter, Nelson provides very candid views of his opinion about the institution of the slave trade. And since its writing, it has been one of the critical pieces of evidence suggesting his support for the institution of the slave trade. And antagonists of Nelson have seized upon his words as evidence that he may have harbored racist opinions, or even, as was suggested only a couple of years ago by Afia Hirsch, the journalist, that he was in some sense a white supremacist. So this single letter has been repeatedly cited as key evidence in his personal opinion.
So, Martyn, my understanding is the original letter as written at sea in 1805 is no longer in existence. What is the document that you have found?
So the letter, the original letter to Simon Taylor, this important plantation owner in Jamaica, is assumed lost. The only surviving example that we have in Nelson's hand is in the pressed copybook that he kept in Victory to copy his letters. And it has been suggested previously that the letters he kept in his pressed copybook were of a secret or private nature. However, soon after the Battle of Trafalgar, the letter appeared in the press in London and was published by William Cobbett, a very fierce anti-abolitionist of the slave trade, in Cobbett's Political Register. The letter was published at a period when the slave trade bill was being debated in the House of Lords and then the Commons. And so the letter was used by anti-abolitionists to capitalize on Nelson's fame in support of their argument for the continuation of the slave trade. The document that came to light only a couple of years ago in a collection of historical papers belonging to a private collector who had recently died is a copy of Nelson's letter, an apparent contemporary copy of Nelson's letter. However, it is a fabricated copy in which there are some 25 changes from the letter that survives in Nelson's pressed copybook. And the document, in addition, has a fake Nelson signature and a false Nelson seal applied to it. And the copy that has now come to light suggests that the letter was manufactured and altered and tampered with before it came to London for publication to beef up Nelson's apparent support for the slave trade.
I mean, it's fascinating. We'll show people images of that through the video. It doesn't look quite like a normal Nelson letter that we see, but there've been some quite significant efforts to make it look credible, haven't there?
There have. I mean, in the absence of the original letter now lost, it feels to me that this was a document that was produced soon after the Battle of Trafalgar. The document is annotated with an additional note mentioning the Battle of Trafalgar. And it strikes me that the document was manufactured by the anti-abolitionist cause for distribution and for circulation, probably among the coffee houses of the City of London, to demonstrate Nelson's apparent support for their cause. It strikes me as a public document, which was then, of course, published as well by William Cobbett. So it's a document that's been passed around, handed around, in an attempt to establish Nelson's support for their cause.
Yeah, it's definitely not later though, is it? I mean, I think you've found the watermark on it. It feels like it's absolutely contemporary to that 1807 debate.
Absolutely. The paper on which it is written is watermark 1798. The document itself has certain features and characteristics to it and mentions certain dates that tally with a production of around 1806. It mentions the Battle of Trafalgar, but makes a mistake in which member of Nelson's retinue had been killed at the battle. It mentions that Alexander Scott had been killed, Nelson's chaplain had been killed, when in fact it was John Scott. So the news of which Scott had been killed at Trafalgar hadn't yet reached the writer or copyist of the document. So it strikes me that it was probably manufactured within weeks of news of Trafalgar and Nelson's death. The original letter may have been sent to London by Simon Taylor, for whom it was a gift of propaganda. Of course, Simon Taylor was a vehement anti-abolitionist and a leading proponent of the anti-abolition cause. He was a friend of William Cobbett, and I have no doubt he sent Nelson's letter, which landed in his lap, to Cobbett and asked Cobbett to immediately exploit it and capitalize on Nelson's words.
So I think it's so important to understand the context for the content and the production of the letter. And I think fantastic, and that's part of what we'll show, and as we show extracts from the letter through this video. But I think it's also important to understand, this was written at sea in June 1805, I think.
Yes.
Why do you think that the letter was written and sent to Taylor? I mean, this was a frantic, busy period in which Nelson was chasing Villeneuve's fleet, and yet he chooses to write to Taylor at that point. So what do you feel the motivation of Nelson and your understanding of Nelson, what led him to write this?
So Nelson, it's been suggested that Nelson was a close friend of Simon Taylor. Nelson had served in the West Indies for two lengthy periods, both in the 1770s and again in the 1780s. And he certainly knew Simon Taylor, particularly when he recuperated in Jamaica in the late 1770s. However, they were not friends. And in the letter, Nelson makes it quite clear that he had been acquainted with Simon Taylor for some 30 years, but there's no suggestion that they were close friends. However, it's quite clear that Nelson was writing the letter on arrival in the West Indies at that date at the suggestion of his chaplain, Alexander Scott, who was serving in Victory alongside him. Scott had recently lost a very valuable ecclesiastical living in the West Indies, and it's quite obvious that Nelson was writing to Taylor in an attempt to seek for that living to be restored to Scott. Scott had constantly badgered Nelson for months beforehand for Nelson's assistance and patronage in securing not only livings in the West Indies, but also in England, to such an extent that, in fact, for many years after Trafalgar, Scott kept referring to Nelson's patronage. So Nelson was using this document at Scott's suggestion to try and promote Scott's cause. But in doing so, he sought to reflect some of the opinions that Taylor himself had sent him some years earlier. In a letter dated 1802, Taylor had written to Nelson explaining how there had been many slave revolts in the West Indies and how people were being massacred. And he wrote in a very inflammatory manner. And in the letter to Taylor, in which, of course, he's seeking favor, Nelson, to a certain degree, reflects Taylor's anger, as Nelson often did to correspondents, to further connect himself with them. Nelson sent the letter, but in it he goes further, and he admits in the letter that he goes a bit too far in explaining his support for the institution of the slave trade, which I have no doubt he did. And in the letter he describes himself as a member of the old school. Nelson was a very conservatively minded naval officer. The slave trade was part of the trade that the Royal Navy was tasked with protecting. However, in a key statement seized upon both then and now, he had suggested that he was a very fierce opponent of William Wilberforce, and William Wilberforce's, as he wrote in the original letter, damnable, cruel doctrine. in the copy letter and in the letter that was subsequently published by the anti-abolitionists, that phrase has been altered to damnable and cursed doctrine. Now, the change may seem marginal, but Nelson's principal reason for supporting the slave trade, as it was for many naval officers, as it was repeated in the slave trade inquiries in Parliament in the late 1780s, was that the slave trade not only, of course, increased Britain's trade production and sugar production, but was the best means of preserving the health and well-being of the enslaved black people. And with a series of revolts and rebellions and massacres in the West Indies, across the West Indian Islands, in the years preceding 1805, Nelson feared, as many officers stated they did, that the abolition of the slave trade would cause many of the enslaved black people to be massacred, as many had already been in San Domingo and Dominica. And however, of course, the principal reason that the anti-abolitionists wanted to retain the slave trade was because of their own wealth and trade and prosperity. And so they had no feeling for the enslaved black people at all. So that phrase was changed from cruel doctrine to cursed doctrine deliberately.
Yeah, I think that's very important context, Martyn, for the letter itself, written privately, and probably overstepping and overstating in order to curry favour, and with no expectation of it being formally published.
Yeah.
And then to have those changes that add emphasis and add a spin, as it were, and that then repeating through the last 200 years. I think that just emphasizes to us, doesn't it, how important it is to study objectively the background, the context, the content of these documents. And I think, thank you, Martyn, so much for, first of all, donating the letter, bringing it to light. I think it'll be fascinating for people in the museum to be able to see it. But I think also, particularly thank you for your researches into it and the textual changes within it that are going to help us understand the depth of Nelson's views, the reasons for them, and what produced what is this oft-cited quotation. So I think it's a very timely introduction, very timely donation, and really thank you again from the museum for doing that, and look forward to sharing this with people, and let people see the evidence for themselves. So Martyn, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Great pleasure, Matthew. Thank you very much.
Many thanks.